Weinstein is Don Postles.
Topping Eyewitness News tonight, Americans are breathing a sigh of relief tonight with word that President Reagan will recover from an attempt on his life. The unthinkable became real this afternoon as the president was shot while leaving a meeting at the Washington Hilton. 3 other people were gunned down, and one lies in critical condition at this hour. And as America held its breath, President Reagan underwent a 2-hour operation to remove a bullet from his lung. A spokesman from George Washington University Hospital emerged to say that Mr. Reagan sailed through the surgery and is in stable, good condition.
The president, however, is an excellent physical specimen, and we do not anticipate any problems. It is always hard to be precise as to how long he'll be hospitalized, but he is clear of head and should be able to make decisions by tomorrow, certainly.
The bullet went 3 inches into the president's chest, hit a rib, and ricocheted into his lung. Yet doctors say Mr. Reagan has survived the shooting without any major problems.
We do not believe there's any permanent injury. The heart area was explored. The heart was not involved at all. There were no major bleeding points in the lung, and there was no involvement of the aorta, the major vessel running through the chest.
Mr. Reagan's press secretary, James Brady, has not fared nearly as well. Brady is in critical condition at this hour at George Washington University Hospital. A bullet tore through his head. And if Brady lives, doctors say he's likely to suffer permanent brain damage. Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy and Washington, D.C. police officer Thomas Delahanty are in serious condition tonight after being shot during the assassination attempt.
Who is John Hinckley, the man who allegedly tried to kill President Reagan today? The FBI says Hinckley was arrested in Nashville, Tennessee last October when President Carter was there and he had 3 handguns in his possession. Information on that arrest is on its way to Washington. Tonight, Hinckley, who lives in Colorado, stands charged with attempted assassination. John Warnick Hinckley Jr. is the son of wealthy parents. Officials at Highland Park High School in Dallas say Hinckley was an average student and caused no problems. This is Hinckley's class photo from Texas Tech University in Lubbock. Classmates say he was outgoing and popular. Teachers again describe him as an average student. Nothing in his record indicating he might take the kind of action taken today in Washington.
The shooting of President Reagan startled and disgusted Americans across the country. Former Texas Governor John Connally, wounded in the same shooting that killed President Kennedy, expressed shock, sadness, and outrage at the shooting. Governor William Milliken of Michigan called the attempted assassination a sad, sad commentary on American life. And former President Gerald Ford expressed grave concern. And the president's brother, Neil Reagan, told reporters outside his home in San Diego that he wasn't surprised by the shooting.
I was almost sure it would happen.
You say you were almost sure it would happen?
Sure.
Why is that, sir?
Isn't that the tenor of the country in the last several years? Huh? You know, if you're going to kill a man, his wife, and 3 little kids out here, as was done over this weekend here in the San Diego area, why not go for big game?
On Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963. Sometimes even tight security isn't enough, though. A political figure is exceptionally vulnerable during a campaign. Bobby Kennedy, shot and killed in 1968 during a victory celebration in Los Angeles. George Wallace, shot at a shopping center in Maryland in 1972, crippled for life. And Martin Luther King, killed during a campaign of a different sort, Memphis, 1968. While all these shootings occurred at a particularly traumatic time in American life, they are not without grim precedent. November 1950, 2 Puerto Rican nationalists tried to invade Blair House to assassinate President Truman. A Secret Service guard was killed, but Truman was unhurt. In fact, he kept all his appointments that day, commenting, "A president has to expect those things." 2 weeks before Franklin Roosevelt became president, a mentally ill bricklayer took a shot at him, but a bystander grabbed the assassin's arm. The bullet missed Roosevelt, but fatally wounded Chicago Mayor Anton Chernak. 1901, William McKinley was shot to death by an anarchist who professed a desire to kill a great ruler. 20 years earlier, 1881, James Garfield. 1865, Abraham Lincoln. And in all of these cases, the assassin or the would-be assassin used a rifle or a handgun. Tim O'Brien, ABC News, New York.
We'll show you virtually the same sequence. Mike Deaver with the bald head suddenly flinches. The Secret Service agent takes a hit in the stomach. The Metropolitan policeman, hat flies off. James Brady down just in front of him. Arms go out to the right, and down they go on the assailant. By this time, President Reagan has been hustled into the car. In a series of still pictures, you will see in even slower motion what has happened. The president and James Brady now waving at the crowd in the middle of your picture. Suddenly, there's the gunshot. The president is looking this way. He hears the noise. The Secret Service agent in the middle is about to go down. There's the president beginning to flinch a bit. Then the Secret Service agent begins to fall. The president is now in a half crouch, being shoved into the presidential limousine by his agents. The agent is about to fall. He's down now. The policeman is down. And there on the right side of your picture, you can see a .22 caliber handgun in the left hand of the assailant. And there's Hinckley, coat over his head, being hustled off by the police, by the agents, for interrogation.
Of the three others injured in the attack, White House Press Secretary Jim Brady is in the worst condition. He's described tonight as fighting for his life with a bullet wound in his head. Secret Service agent Clarence McCarthy, shot in the stomach, is in critical condition, as is Washington policeman Thomas Delahunty, who was shot in the chest. Delahunty, a canine squad officer, managed to jump the attacker before he collapsed. The scene of the assassination attempt was only blocks from George Washington University Hospital. There were several eyewitnesses in both places.
Two agents got him and a police officer. I'm not sure. There was guns being pulled out all over the place at that point. I heard about maybe 4 to 5 shots, and all came from...
Your camera stayed on people going down and Reagan getting in the limousine?
Yes, and on the and them wrestling the gunmen.
And you got him wrestling the gunmen?
Yes.
Did you see anybody shoot? We can get the car. Okay. By that green rail? The grassy knoll up there?
No. I was busy with the action that was right in front of me.
Good. Prosper, what did you see? Where were you?
I was standing on the driveway, and I was walking outside, Sam, and all of a sudden I heard 4 shots. I turned around, and I just saw a lot of bodies moving in different groups. I saw Jim on the ground.
Jim Brady?
Jim Brady. And then I saw another group against the wall, and at that point the limousine had already moved.
Well, I was watching Reagan the whole time, and from what I saw...
Good evening. Tonight, in a special extended edition of Nightline, we'll focus on what lies ahead for Egypt, for the Middle East, and for the United States. We'll talk with former President Jimmy Carter, with former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former CIA Director Richard Helms, with the Israeli Ambassador Ephraim Evron, and with contributing analyst George Will. We'll have a commentary from ABC's David Brinkley and a remembrance of Anwar Sadat from Barbara Walters.
This is an expanded edition of ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
Good evening. Perhaps we shouldn't be shocked by this sort of thing anymore, not during a year in which one man came within inches of killing the Pope and another came equally close to killing the President of the United States. Nor perhaps should we even lay claim to being surprised at today's events in Cairo. After all, only a few weeks ago, President Sadat ordered the expulsion of more than 1,000 Soviets from Egypt, among them Moscow's ambassador, because Sadat claimed the Soviets were involved in massive subversion and plots against his government. Indeed, by the most conservative estimates, Sadat ordered the arrest and detention of more than 1,500 of his domestic religious and political opponents during the past few months alone. So it was clear that trouble was brewing in Egypt, and it was painfully obvious that Anwar Sadat had many enemies at home and abroad. Nevertheless, it was a surprise. It did come as a shock, particularly since the day began so well. ABC's Doreen Kays was an eyewitness from beginning to end.
President Sadat had motorcaded to the parade site from the Defense Ministry, which was a couple of miles away. He arrived. He was dressed in a new military uniform none of us had ever seen before. This was a brand new one. He seemed to be in an upbeat mood, and it was going to be a festive parade. There was a lot of U.S. military, a lot of U.S. arms that had never been on display before, and he was very proud to be watching this. Things were progressing nicely, and the parade was almost halfway. We were halfway through the parade. There were jets roaring overhead in a very low fly path, a rather frightening one. When suddenly a group phone. It took seconds to realize that the bullets were for real. A spray of bullets aimed directly at the Egyptian president, the vice president, the defense minister, and their entourage. Utter pandemonium broke out. Got back to the reviewing stand, which was only a matter of minutes. It was just a sight of devastation. President Sadat was nowhere in sight. He had obviously been removed by helicopter immediately and taken to the hospital.
According to the official Middle East news agency, President Sadat was dead on arrival at Mahdi Military Hospital here in Cairo. According to the official medical report, Sadat was unconscious, had no pulse or heartbeat. His eyes were open and he did not respond to light. He had no movement in his body. He had 2 bullet wounds in the chest, 1 in the left temple, 1 in the neck, 2 bullet wounds in the left leg above the knee, and 1 bullet wound in the arm. And blood flowed from his mouth.
Sadat's last day began as he met his generals at the Defense Ministry. Then he was cheered along the motorcade route to the parade grounds for the annual celebration of Egypt's partial victory in the 1973 war with Israel. He laid the traditional wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier and settled down to watch the display of Egypt's military might, much of it now purchased from the United States. Flanked by his Vice President, Hosni Mubarak, and Defense Minister Mohammed Abu Ghazala, Sadat saluted as the various units passed in review. Then, just after the tanks and anti-tank units passed, while a formation of jets roared overhead, there was a puff of smoke and a flash in front of the reviewing stand, followed by a hail of gunfire. Pandemonium ensued. Ambassadors, military attachés, spectators fled the scene, leaving the dead and wounded behind. It took several minutes for the impact of what had happened to sink in. Amid a heap of bodies, Sadat lay gravely wounded. Vice President Mubarak was led away. Defense Minister Abu Ghazala, blood on his face, directed the seizure of the attackers. Though there is no precise information available yet, it's believed Sadat's personal secretary and his photographer were killed, and a number of other Egyptians were wounded. Sadat was rushed to the Mahdi Military Hospital in a suburb of Cairo, the hospital where the Shah of Iran spent his last days. He died 2 hours later of multiple wounds. The funeral is set for Saturday. A little-known group calling itself the Independent Organization for the Liberation of Egypt, based in Beirut and led by a former chief of staff of the Egyptian army, has claimed responsibility for the attack. 3 of the 6 attackers were killed at the assassination site. The people of Egypt did not learn of the assassination officially until Vice President Mubarak spoke on radio and television in early evening. The Vice President said it was Allah's will that Sadat should die on the day of the October victory, and he pledged Egypt would continue in the tradition of peace established by Sadat. For the moment, though, the President pro tem is Sufi Abu Taleb, the Speaker of the People's Assembly, although Mubarak is all but certain to win election as president 60 days from now, as called for in the Egyptian constitution. It's past midnight now, and Cairo is reported calm. But if the wave of emotion that followed Gamal Abdel Nasser's death 11 years ago is repeated, that calm may not last long. Mitchell Krause, CBS News, Cairo.
8 weeks ago, he arrived in Washington for his first meeting with Ronald Reagan. The public part of their agenda dealt with peace in the Mideast. The secret agenda, Libya, a series of discussions so sensitive that only a handful of officials know more than a few details. Since 1975, Mr. Sadat had periodically proposed sending a force of Egyptian troops into Libya, and on at least 2 occasions, according to American diplomats, he was restrained by the United States, most forcefully by President Jimmy Carter. Today, former ambassador to Egypt, Herman Alts, told me, "I passed the word from Jimmy Carter to Sadat that we could not support an invasion. The rationale was that it might not succeed, that the Carter administration could have good relations even with Libya, and that Congress would never approve in the era of post-Watergate reform. Iltz was ambassador from 1973 to 1979. Many times, he said, Sadat talked about Gaddafi trying to kill him, described one or another Libyan assassination team picked up in Egypt. Indeed, Gaddafi publicly proclaimed that Sadat would be struck down, and today he was exultant. Last month, Sadat had canceled a visit to Austria after an assassination plot and stockpiled arms were discovered by authorities there. Ronald Reagan, according to his key aides, told Anwar Sadat that the United States and Egypt must isolate the Gaddafi regime and ultimately watch it fall. The two men were to discuss the matter again, and last week, Hosni Mubarak, Mr. Sadat's successor, undertook a mission to Washington to urge President Reagan to hasten that process, supply more arms to resist Libyan moves against Chad and the Sudan, and more important, resist any Libyan provocation of Egypt itself. Tonight, American and Egyptian intelligence authorities stress they have no hard evidence of who was responsible for Sadat's death. His enemies were many: the PLO, radical Muslims, the Soviets, the Iranians, domestic opponents. But Anwar Sadat, according to those who knew him best, was convinced that if he died violently, there would be little doubt about the forces behind his death. They were in Tripoli, he said, in Muammar Gaddafi's revolutionary Libya. Carl Bernstein, ABC News, New York.
Perhaps the most definable starting point for what we now call the Middle East peace process was in the shuttle diplomacy missions of Henry Kissinger during the Nixon administration. Former Secretary of State Kissinger is standing by live now in our New York studios, and in our Washington studios, former CIA Director Richard Helms. Secretary Kissinger, what Carl Bernstein referred to as President Sadat's obsession with Libya, with Muammar Gaddafi, justified, do you think?
I think it is justified. I wouldn't ascribe it to any particular plot. I would say that there has been a movement towards radicalism, an increasing reliance on violence, unopposed by the moderate forces, which created a climate in which a particular order.
Reagan and Brezhnev included, whose death would have left that much uncertainty over the course of events, not just in Egypt, not just in the Middle East, but everywhere. What happens over the next few weeks and months in Egypt could change our world as much as a Yom Kippur War, which Anwar Sadat launched exactly 8 years ago today. Joe Schlesinger, CBC News.
Beyond the Middle East, there was dismay and confusion. From Canada, fears for the stability of Egypt. From the United States, how to rescue the peace process begun at Camp David. Without Sadat, everything is up in the air. We have two reports, the first from Washington.
Today, the people of the United States join with the people of Egypt and all those who long for a better world in mourning the death of Anwar Sadat.
2:30 p.m., 6 hours after he first got word of the attack on President Sadat, Ronald Reagan pays tribute to the slain Egyptian leader.
His death today, an act of infamy, cowardly infamy, fills us with horror.
Reagan's remarks were simple and direct. They reflected the emotion he felt at the moment. They did not reflect the chaos that was evident all day at the White House and the State Department. It was a day when a country with the most sophisticated intelligence network in the world was forced to learn the details of this momentous event from the American television reporters.
We have just received a call from someone who is affiliated with CBS who says that the president has passed away.
I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but what you have just said is unsettling to say the least. Do I understand you to report that someone affiliated with our CBS News Bureau in Cairo is reporting that President Sadat has what?
By midday, the administration acknowledged that the news reports were accurate. But at the State Department, as reporters waited for the regular briefing, officials were reluctant to answer the questions that were foremost on everyone's minds. What happens now to the Camp David peace process? And what happens to the controversial sale of the sophisticated military hardware, including the AWACS, the radar planes, to Saudi Arabia? On Capitol Hill, a key vote on the sale was delayed for a day, and the reaction of the senators shed no light on the chances of the $8.5 billion sale being approved.
I think we ought to step back, take a good look at that, not rushed into judgment.
In terms of the proposed AWACS sale to Saudi Arabia, it's probably a setback because a major argument, a setback for the sale, which already seemed doomed, but a major argument against it that I and others have made is that there's so much turmoil and instability in the Middle East that we have to be fearful that that sophisticated plane, if it went to Saudi Arabia, might fall into the hands of our adversaries.
I've come to the conclusion if there's ever a time to support the President of the United States, right now is that time. And so I'm going to change, and I'm going to support President Reagan on the AWACS decision.
The White House says it intends to push ahead with the AWACS sale. It's the cornerstone of its Middle East policy. But this cornerstone was always fragile, and now Sadat's death threatens that other pillar, the Camp David peace process.
We have informed our friends abroad of the situation, the President's condition as we know it, stable, now undergoing surgery, and there are absolutely no alert measures that are necessary at this time or contemplated.
Throughout the afternoon, aides went to great lengths to reassure the public that Mr. Reagan was alert with his sense of humor intact.
As he was going down the hall on the gurney, I guess they call him, to surgery, he winked at Baker. He had earlier told Senator Laxalt, who was there, don't worry about me, I'll make it. He had told Mrs. Reagan, honey, I forgot to duck. I forgot to duck. And as they were wheeling him into surgery, he saw Meese and Baker and Deaver there, and he said, who's minding the store? And then when he got into the operating room, he looked at the doctors and he said, please tell me you're Republicans.
The president came out of surgery at 5:30, but it wasn't till 8:15 that Vice President Bush, who had flown back to Washington from Texas this afternoon, assured the nation that the president was okay.
I am deeply heartened by Dr. O'Leary's report on the president's condition. That he has emerged from this experience with flying colors and with the most optimistic prospects for a complete recovery.
Late word tonight, Mrs. Reagan is back in the White House. She's described as fine and calm. There was one final dispatch, a press notice put out by the White House. It reads, and I quote, at 8:50 this evening, the president joked with his doctors in the recovery room, and despite the tubes in his mouth, he handed them a handwritten note which said, all in all, I'd rather be in Philadelphia. Leslie Stahl, CBS News, the White House.
Well, it hasn't been a day in which one has been able to smile very much, but certainly that note scribbled by the president would bring a smile to anyone. The Meese, Deaver, and Baker referred to by White House aide Lynn Nofziger inside that report by Leslie Stahl, of course, refers to Ed Meese, Michael Deaver, and Jim Baker, who are President Reagan's three chief White House assistants. They were at the hospital as he was rolled into the operating room. You'll recall that there was a row last week between Secretary of State Haig and the White House over who should head President Reagan's crisis management team. And in the first hours after the president was shot today, the Secretary of State was again at the center of some confusion. Bruce Morton reports.
The flap started because Vice President Bush was in Texas and Secretary of State Alexander Haig turned up at the White House, temporarily in charge, but seeming to imply there was more to it than that.
Constitutionally, gentlemen, you have the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State in that order. And should the President decide he wants to transfer the helm to the Vice President, he will do so.
Who makes that decision, Mr.
As
Secretary,
of now,
if
I
he
am
can?
in control here in the White House.
That was wrong. At least it was wrong if Haig really meant a constitutional succession. That runs President, Vice President, then Speaker of the House. Deputy White House Press Secretary Larry Speakes suggested what was really involved was administrative control. But Speakes' list was also different from Haig's.
There is, for your information, an automatic assumption of command authority that requires no steps be taken. It goes first on the Vice President and second on the Secretary of Defense.
What Speaks apparently meant was military control. The Secretary of State is, for whatever it's worth, the senior member of the cabinet.
I don't know what arrangement he had with Vice President Bush with respect to crisis management, which has been much in the news in the last 72 hours. I would think that he could very well regard himself as a senior member of the cabinet. I think that history is on his side. On the other hand, when Secretary of State Robert Lansing, during Wilson's incapacitation in the World War I era, called a cabinet meeting without informing the president, Wilson promptly fired him.
Vice President Bush was back in the White House by evening, and the argument began to seem more and more abstract.
I can reassure this nation and a watching world that the American government is functioning fully and effectively.
White House staffer David Gergen may have come closest to explaining what really happened.
People gathered here spontaneously. They came because of the situation we were in. And the Vice President was in contact, and the Chief of Staff, and Mr. Meese and others were in complete contact. And we frankly didn't spend a great deal of time sorting through the statutory books and that sort of thing.
So there it rests. In the real world, doctors say the president will be well enough tomorrow, probably, to make decisions. Vice President Bush seems certain to play an increased formal role while the president recovers. And Mr. Reagan's inner circle of advisors will obviously try to take some of the smaller issues off his hands in the meantime. Bruce Morton, CBS News, Washington.
There is a report tonight that John Hinckley, the suspect in today's shooting, may have been expelled from the Nazi-style National Socialist Party of America more than a year ago. United Press International quotes a party spokesman as saying Hinckley was expelled because he, quote, wanted to shoot people and blow things up, end of quotation. That spokesman, according to UPI, also called Hinckley, again, quote, a nut, unquote. West European leaders, often at odds among themselves, are united tonight in their sentiments of dismay and best wishes for a speedy recovery. From London, Tom Fenton reports it is not only the leaders expressing those sentiments.
Early morning editions of London newspapers ran banner headlines. Most of them gave the news without comment. But a London taxi driver expressed the thought that was in many people's minds here after hearing the news.
Guns are very plentiful in America. Anybody can get a gun if they want one. That's the difference between here and London.
Britain's Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher said she was shocked and sent a message to the president saying that she prayed his injuries were not serious. France's President Giscard d'Estaing sent his heartfelt wishes for the president's complete recovery. West Germany's Chancellor Helmut Schmidt expressed his deepest disgust and said he hoped for the president's earliest recovery. The expressions of concern that came from every capital in Western Europe were much more than routine messages of sympathy. The President of the United States is also the leader of the Western Alliance. In a time of international uncertainty, with the possibility of Russian intervention in Poland, the attempt on the president's life has added another element of uncertainty. The leaders of Western Europe, who welcomed President Reagan's election and look forward to a period of more effective American leadership, have strong reasons to wish for the president's speedy recovery. Tom Fenton, CBS News, London.
Congressman Morris Udall said today, it's as though we were watching an instant replay of an American nightmare. And Senator Edward Kennedy recalled, year after year in recent times, we have seen violence in this country. My brother John and my brother Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, George Wallace, Al Lowenstein, Vernon Jordan, the attacks on President Ford, and now the attack on President Reagan. End of quotation from Senator Kennedy. Phil Jones reports now on other reaction in the Capitol.
On the Senate floor prior to today's attempted assassination, well-meaning senators opposed to the president's budget cuts were denouncing the Reagan administration for its alleged broken promises. But when Majority Leader Baker came onto the floor to announce that the president had been shot, No one was in the mood to do any more criticizing, and business was halted. Democrat Claiborne Pell described the atmosphere as being one of shock and horror. Senator Henry Jackson commented, "Again, our hopes are dashed that violence would not visit an American president." House Speaker Thomas O'Neill, who is second in the line of presidential succession, stayed secluded in his office today. He did receive a phone call from Secretary of State Haig telling the Speaker that key cabinet members had gathered at the White House. And security for all congressional leaders was beefed up shortly after the shooting. Although many of the Reagan political views are in some trouble on Capitol Hill, the president is personally popular. And so in political reality, these unfortunate events of today will probably help him in getting his program through. But in one area, the president's longtime opposition to handgun control, this will probably present problems. For it is sure to be ammunition for those in Congress who want such controls. As Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York put it today, how much shooting is going to happen before we get rid of those guns? Phil Jones, CBS News, Washington.
It seems terrifying to a layman. A 70-year-old man is shot in the chest with a bullet that enters his lung. But doctors said President Reagan was at no time in any serious danger and faces an excellent prognosis for recovery. Richard Wagner explains why.
The encouraging news that the president was out of surgery came from George Washington University Hospital spokesman, Dr. Dennis O'Leary.
The president is in the recovery room. He is in stable condition, and he is awake. He was in no time in any serious danger. He was alert and awake with stable vital signs up until the time he underwent anesthesia. He was in the operating room for approximately 2 hours. Part of that time was spent ascertaining that he did not have any blood in his abdominal cavity. Indeed, he did not.
Dr. O'Leary described where the bullet struck the president as Mr. Reagan was about to enter his limousine.
Traversed down approximately 3 inches, striking the top of the 7th rib laterally, and then going about 3 inches into the tissue of the lung itself.
It deflected downward further from the 7th rib?
No, it's like coming down, hitting the rib, and then deflecting in to take a new path.
Dr. O'Leary used the phrase rock stable to categorize the president's vital signs during the entire operation, and he said Mr. Reagan should be able to continue to make the judgments required by his office.
I think that I would urge him to limit his physical activity within reason. There is no reason to believe that he has any impairment of his ability to make decisions or what have you. Making decisions is stressful business, but I think he's going to be fully up to it.
Welcome news for an anxious nation. Richard Wagner, CBS News, New York.
Let's go back now to George Washington University Hospital and Jim McManus for an update on the president's condition and the conditions of the others, including White House Press Secretary James Brady. Jim?
It's clear from the medical reports here that President Reagan is not only a strong man, he is a lucky man. Doctors say that during surgery, the president's vital signs were rock solid, that he is physically younger than his years. And a lucky man because the bullet that entered his left chest missed his heart, missed every major blood vessel before burying itself in the lung tissue. They say the president is recovering nicely. And a slightly optimistic report now on Press Secretary Jim Brady. Doctors say his reflexes indicate that the brain stem is functioning. His wife reportedly entered his room just a little while ago, squeezed her husband's hand, and Jim Brady squeezed back. The next official medical briefing at 8:30 tomorrow morning. The word here now is the president is in good and stable condition. Dan?
Thank you, Jim McManus. Of course, CBS News will be staffed at the hospital throughout the early morning, and we'll have full reports on Morning with Charles Kuralt tomorrow morning. Hearing the news at a club today, President Reagan's brother, Neil, said, "I broke down and began to cry. I expected something like this to come. It's the way society is today." The president's younger daughter, actress Patti Davis, was reportedly shocked and praying for her father. His youngest son, Ronald Prescott Reagan, left a ballet tour in Lincoln, Nebraska, to fly with his wife for Washington. And there was this reaction from the president's other children.
He's a great man, and he's been a great father. And I just hope the people understand that we do care, even though we're independent. And we hope things like this stop. If they stop happening in our country, it's unfortunate they do. But more than anything, I think you'll find out that the Reagan family, or the first family, we love Ronald Reagan. We also love our country. We want to be there to wish him back to health.
I am not prepared to accept this, whether it was my father or anybody else. I have seen throughout the day the reaction of other members of the family. Mine is fury and rage and anger, and that in this country, this kind of garbage still goes on. And it is not going to happen to this president. By God, it is not going to happen to this president, really. And I think that the American people have got to become angry about the crime in this country, about the ability of people to do this to other human beings, and we have got to stop it. And we've got to stop it right now.
What can the American people do?
The American people can get angry, and they can start to propose policies and laws that have effect, that have teeth, that can be enforced both through the courts and by law enforcement. And they'll do that when they get angry enough.
Are you speaking of gun control?
I've often said that perhaps it's not guns we should license, but ammunition. But something has to be done.
The president's daughter. Been reports by the president's doctors that he is in no danger as we pass out of this day and into a new one. First there was Lincoln, and then Garfield and McKinley and Kennedy, all of them killed by assassins' bullets. And 4 presidents have been targets of assassins: Jackson, Truman, Ford, shot at twice, and today Reagan. Theodore Roosevelt was shot at when he was campaigning for president. He was shot, as a matter of fact, while campaigning for president. Franklin Roosevelt was shot at when he was president-elect. These facts, culled from our nation's history, are unpleasant, but unfortunately, they are worth pondering as this day closes. Worth pondering again. Dan Rather, CBS News, New York. Good night.
This has been a CBS News special report. The shooting of the president.